Okay, let's add a feature. We're going to, in our application, well, first off, I added a little bit of styling here. I threw Bootstrap on the thing. If you look at my index HTML, I added a link to the CDN for Bootstrap, the CSS library. In my app component HTML, I wrapped my counter up in a container so it'll display properly. And then on my buttons, I added a little bit of styling from Bootstrap. You can see getbootstrap.com for more details. So my buttons look nice and blue. It was just kind of a little too much of a downer for me before. So we're going to add a feature that our power users want to be able to not only count by ones, but also have the option to count by ones, threes, or fives. So they're going to be able to select what they'd like to count by. I'm going to go to Bootstrap, copy a little button group, add that, see what it looks like. I'll just go into the counter component for a moment here, paste that in there, see what it looks like on the web page. Need a break, so I'm going to put both of those things in divs so they're block level elements. We could do a little cleaner job with the styling here, but we'll add a div around this, doing it Yoda style, doing the closing element first. And the button's already a div. So yeah, it'll appear something like that, except they'll say 1, 3, or 5. Now, when I'm creating components, I don't like to go back and touch them if they're already working. So I'm actually going to create a separate component for this, counter count by. And that's where that HTML is going to go. So in the new component I just created, counter count by, in the HTML, I will paste that button group, clean it up a little bit, give it a better label for screen readers, things like that. And instead of left, middle, and right, it will be 1, 3, or 5. Now we have to decide where we want that to appear. I'm going to leave that up to the app component. So I'm just going to tell the app component, just show this thing right underneath my counter for right now. This will also help us see kind of the separation of this. Once you have shared global state, these components really don't need to know about each other or be in any kind of hierarchy. So I also want to make sure that whatever they're counting by is disabled so they can tell what they're counting by. And we'll have to remember to add that in at the end. So on the component here, I'm going to create a little method, set count by. You tell me what you want to count by. And this is where we'll eventually dispatch an action. That's all we can ever do is select from the store, dispatch an action. And then over in the template, through the miracle of the alt-click thing in Visual Studio Code, on each of those, I'm going to say when they click on them, call this set count by. And the first one will pass a 1, then a 3, then a 5. So we're going to need an action to dispatch in that method, and it sounds like it's related to our counter. So I'm going to go into the counter component. Now, while I could create 3 separate actions, count by 1, count by 3s, count by 5s, that sounds boring and repetitive. So we're going to create a action that actually contains a little data along with it. It'll ask us what that data is when we dispatch it, and that data will be available to our reducer when we update the state. And you use the props helper from NGRX store for that. So this is going to say, when you dispatch this action, give me some data that says what they want to count by, which is a number. Back in the counter count by component, I'm going to inject the store. You type this little thing a lot when you're doing NGRX. Take our application state, and then in set count by, no logic here, just pass that on to the action, and eventually that will end up in the store, and we'll decide what that means to our store. So set count by, and you can see it takes one property, which is by, so I pass that in. I always like to go back to the HTML and check, make sure I'm dispatching the right thing with the right data now. So I can see this one dispatches 1, this one dispatches an action with the by property of 3, and this one is 5. So the only thing you can do with, now it's not doing anything yet. We have to update our reducer, and that's the only thing you can really do with an action is create a new application state when it's dispatched. Or I guess you could do nothing. You could ignore it, which is what we're doing right now. So if I open up my reducers, index.ts on the left, counter reducer on the right, it turns out we don't have anywhere to store this data. I'm going to need in the reducer function to know what they're counting by. So making our application state here a number isn't enough. So I'm going to create an interface, and I'm going to say, okay, not only do we need to know what the current value is, which I'll call current, and we need to know what they're counting by. Then we'll update our initial state. Remember, initial state is what this should be when the application starts up. And we'll assume they're counting by, we'll start at 1 now, and they're counting by 1. And then on those actions, I can't just return a number, I have to return a whole new state. So I'm going to return a new object that looks like the old state, except current now is the state's current plus 1. And that's a little bit of a bug I'm introducing here to prove a point later. That should actually be what they're counting by, but I want to show you the implications of that. So for decrement, it's the same thing, but -1. And now we have a place to store what they're counting by. So on that new action, count set by, we're going to say the state, and now we need the action because we need that data off the action, right? That by property. So return the state, but for the by property, set that to whatever the action says we should be counting by. Our reducer function down below now doesn't take a number, it takes a counter state, and it has to return a counter state. So I'll update the return type here to make the compiler happy. And then back over in our index.ts, that thing is a number. So I'm going to say, no, it's actually a little more complex now. It's a counter state. And this selector, we used to return, this is what our counter component's relying on, used to return the count, but I'm going to reuse it. I'm going to not export it. I'm going to kind of use it as a utility and say this thing now points to that whole part of my application state. And if you can get there, I'm going to use a function from NGRX called createSelector, saying if you can get to that branch of the state where the counter data lives, here's where the current value lives. And I just called that the same name so it didn't break my component. And so now when I do these, you can see it actually does update the state. If you look at the diff after you set what you're counting by, it updates the state, but we're not incrementing or decrementing by what they want to count by. Bummer. But we know what we did wrong there. We're actually going to use that portion of the state in our other actions. So we're going to say when they increment or decrement, we're going to count by. We're going to increment by what they want to count by. And now look at this. We can count by 1s. We can count by 3s. We can count by 5s. This is going to go viral. People are going to love this. Next Flappy Birds. We have one more little feature we need, which is disabling that button so they know what they're currently counting by. So yeah, right there. So I'm going to just create another selector. In my index, select by equals, we'll use createSelector again. We already know the way to the counter branch, so we'll use that function. And then on the branch, return by. And into our counting by component, we already have the store in there. We'll just create a new observable, call it by. It's an observable of a number. It's going to be 1, 3, or 5. Since it's Angular with strict type checking, I have to put the little exclamation point there to say I'll get to initializing that. Don't worry, hold my beer, I've got this. And then in ng on init, this dot by equals store, select that new selector we created. Using the alt-click wizardry in Visual Studio Code, I'm going to go on each one of these buttons and tell Angular, make this disabled if when the by observable, and use the async. Remember, anytime there's a $sign, you have to use the async pipe, equals either 1, 3, or 5. And let's see how we did. Oh, it's disabled. It's gorgeous. So we're counting by 1s. Clearly now we're counting by 5s. Now we're counting by 3s. Fantastic. And we were able to do that without modifying the existing counter component at all.